I called his name twice. He looked straight at me. 20 feet between us. Morning light. I hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, was still in yesterday's work clothes after spending the night at Greenville Memorial while the doctors told me things about my wife I wasn't ready to hear. He turned around, climbed into a black SUV, and drove away. For a second, I genuinely wondered if I'd mistaken my own brother for a stranger. I hadn't. To understand what happened that morning, you need to go back about 30 years. Ryan was 17 when our father died. I was 22. 3 weeks after the funeral, he came home with an envelope. State University. Full academic acceptance. He sat at the kitchen table and stared at it without opening it, and I already knew why. I can't afford this, he said. I went to the drawer, pulled out a cashier's check I'd gotten that morning, and slid it across the table. You should keep this, he said. You're going to need it. I'm your brother, I said. He looked up. Exactly, I said.
Bro gave up his whole dream just like that. No argument, nothing.
I didn't put the check back in the drawer. I tucked it inside the acceptance letter, folded them together, and handed him both. I had been accepted to an architecture program in Charlotte that same year. I never enrolled. I got my electrician's license instead, took commercial construction jobs, and worked 6 days a week for the next decade. I didn't think of it as giving something up. I thought I was building something. I paid his tuition, his rent, his first 3 years of groceries. When his truck blew a head gasket on I-85, I drove 2 hours to hand him a new set of keys, used but reliable. He stood on the shoulder in the late afternoon heat, looking at me like I'd done something impossible. How did you even, he started. Don't, I said. Just drive safe. His first business failed after 2 years. I covered it. His second one nearly collapsed. I covered that too. I never told anyone. That wasn't the point. The point was watching him walk into rooms with his head up. My wife used to say I loved him like a son, not a brother. She wasn't wrong. Huh? Then the call came about my wife. Highway collision. She went into surgery and I drove to the hospital and didn't leave for 61 hours. My daughter Kayla was 1601. Around hour 14, she leaned against my shoulder in the waiting room and said very quietly, Dad, did you call Uncle Ryan? Yeah, baby, he's coming in the morning. She nodded and closed her eyes. I kept my phone face up on the armrest. 8 o'clock. 9, noon. A nurse came out around 10 and asked if any other family had arrived yet. I told her it was just us. She nodded like she'd heard that answer before and went back through the double doors. Kayla woke up just after noon, groggy, and looked around the waiting room before her eyes settled on me. Did he come? She asked. I shook my head. She didn't say anything else. She just put her head back on my shoulder and closed her eyes again. That was worse than if she'd cried. He never came.
That little girl knew, she already knew he wasn't coming.
Tao. 2 days later, he knocked on my door. Flowers. A real apology. He said he panicked, frozen, given in to the worst version of himself. His voice broke twice. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, and then I let him in. My wife was still in the hospital, but I told her that night. She was quiet for a long time. Do you believe him? She asked. I thought about it honestly. I think he believes himself, I said. She looked at me steadily. That's not the same thing. I knew she was right, but he was all I had left of our father's family. So I let it go. That was my mistake. 3 weeks after he apologized, a former co-worker sent me photos from a leadership conference downtown. He'd spotted Ryan in the background. Same morning, he'd stood me up at the hospital, suit pressed, smiling beside investors like a man who built everything himself. My coworker had pointed across the street at me and asked if we were family. Ryan said I used to work for their father's company. I sat with that. Told myself it was embarrassment. Awkward phrasing under pressure. Then the second thing came. A woman who'd catered one of his investor dinners told a mutual friend what she'd overheard. Someone at the table had asked Ryan who inspired him to start a business. My father, he'd said, not his brother. Not the man who paid his tuition, covered his rent, drove 2 hours to hand him truck keys on the shoulder of I-85. Then the third thing. Someone else at the same dinner had asked him directly, "Any siblings? Anyone who helped you get started?" He'd smiled and said, "No, just me. Always been just me." 30 years. And he'd erased every single year of it with one sentence, in front of people whose opinions he cared more about than the truth.
30 years and he said, just me?
It wasn't one bad morning. He'd been doing this for years. Quietly. Carefully. Every time someone asked about his success, he'd been editing me out of the answer. I didn't call him. I let the silence do what words couldn't. Aha. 11 months later, his world came apart. His partners were caught in a financial scandal. He was cleared, but it didn't matter. The investors walked, the clients followed, and the reputation he'd spent a decade constructing on top of the foundation I'd quietly built for him collapsed inside 6 weeks. He knocked on my door on a Tuesday evening. My wife answered. She stood in the doorway, looking at him. This man who hadn't come when she was in the ICU, who had called her husband a former employee in front of strangers. She stepped aside and let him in without a word. Kayla heard him come in. She walked to the dining room and set an extra plate at the table without being asked. She didn't look at him when she did it, just placed it down quietly and went back to the kitchen. We ate. Nobody mentioned any of it. After dinner, he drifted toward the fireplace. There was an old wooden box on the mantel, worn at the corners, latch loose. He opened it. Receipts. Hundreds of them. Tuition payments. Rent. The truck invoice. Medical bills from the year he had no insurance. Business records from both times I'd kept him afloat. He went through them slowly. Then his hands stopped. At the bottom of the box, underneath everything else, was a folded piece of paper he recognized immediately. His college acceptance letter. The original. 30 years old, the creases soft from being handled. And still tucked inside it, the cashier's check, uncashed. The one I'd slid across the kitchen table the week after our father died. He looked up at me. His face had come completely apart. "You kept it," he said. I nodded. "I'll pay every penny back," he said. His voice barely made it out. "Every single one. I swear." I walked over, took the box gently from his hands, carried it to the fireplace, and set every last receipt into the fire. The acceptance letter went in last. We both watched them catch. "I never kept these because I wanted repayment," I said. "I kept them because I never thought I'd need proof that I loved you." He dropped to his knees right there on the floor. Not dramatically. Just down, like the weight finally had somewhere to go. After a long silence, he said, "Every year it got harder to tell the truth. The lie just became easier than admitting I hadn't built any of this alone." He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was just finally saying the true thing out loud. Then he looked up and said quietly, "I'm your brother." I looked at him kneeling there in the firelight. "Exactly," I said. "Nothing else." Huh. I stepped out the back door. The sky was going orange over the tree line. Behind me, I could hear my wife clearing the table, the soft sound of water running in the kitchen sink. A minute later, Kayla came and stood beside me. She looked at the same sky without saying anything for a while. Then, "Dad, are we ever going to see Uncle Ryan again?" I thought about the flowers he'd brought, the apology I'd accepted too quickly, the dinner table where he'd smiled and said just me. Always been just me. And then the look on his face when he found that letter. "I honestly don't know," I said. She nodded slowly, like that was the most honest answer I could have given her. Maybe it was. Some things burn clean. Some things just burn.
So, if this story makes sense to you, if you learned something from this story, do like the video channel, subscribe the channel, and I will see you in the next video. Take care. Bye bye.